If theta 2 is equal to 0, then this line no longer applies. So we have the model again collapses to price equals marginal cost plus marginal user cost. So the OPEC producers are not colluding if theta 2 is equal to 0. And if theta 2 is in between 0 and 1, then the OPEC producers are colluding, but imperfectly. So the empirical estimation is the following. So again, I've written the general supply side first order condition. I estimate this first order condition using a two-stage least squares regression. So as I mentioned, in a supply equation, we have price and we have non-OPEC countries' individual quantities here and total quantity of OPEC countries here. And these quantities are going to be endogenous because supply quantity and price are simultaneously determined by the supply and demand curves. So we use, I use instruments for both the non-OPEC individual country quantities and the OPEC total quantity. So it's a two-stage least squares regression of price on non-OPEC countries' quantities, total OPEC quantities, marginal cost, and then I also allow variation by decade. So I allow these market structure parameters to potentially vary by decade, so potentially that the market structure might have varied by decade. And so you're probably wondering what I do with this shadow price. So there's two ways I incorporate this shadow price. So the first way is assuming that there are no stock effects. So as I mentioned in the hoteling rule, if there's no stock effects, the shadow price is equal to the initial shadow price times e to the RT. So basically, if you substitute this into the PT, it's as if you're estimating a coefficient P0 times e to the RT. So basically, if you assume an interest rate R, and then you just construct a variable e to the RT, and you regress price on the quantities, the marginal cost, and then e to the RT, the coefficient you get will be P at time 0, so the shadow price at the initial time period. So this is how I incorporate the shadow price, assuming that there are no stock effects. However, there's probably going to be stock effects, so I also allow for a fully flexible stock effect, shadow price. And what I do here is I use year effects. So I allow the shadow price to potentially vary by year, and this allows for potential stock effects. So the data I use are country-level data on extraction, price, and cost of oil for oil between 1970 and 2004. And so I have a table of the summary statistics. And my instruments are for non-OPEC production. I have the country's population, which is going to be a demand shifter, so it's a good instrument for supply. And then for OPEC production, I use world population as a demand shifter, so the instrument for supply for that. And here in my first stage regressions, it's probably hard to see the actual numbers, but you can hopefully see the asterisks which show that the instruments, which are the population instruments, are significant. So they're good instruments. So my results support oligopolistic behavior among non-OPEC producers. So there's market power among non-OPEC producers, and then among OPEC producers, there's collusion among OPEC producers, so they behave like a monopolist, except in the last 15 years of my data set. So here you can see the first two specifications here are going to be the ones where I don't, I just estimate the theta 1 and theta 2, those market power coefficients. I estimate them for the entire time period. So here, the first one is going to be the theta 1 parameter, and so, or the theta 1 times the derivative of the demand function. And so this is, you can see that it's positive, and so this is suggested that theta 1 is not 0. It's significantly different from 0. And then similarly for theta 2. And then when I vary by decade, you can see that it's significant for the first couple of decades, but not for the last 15 years. And similarly for OPEC. So there's market power for non-OPEC producers and market collusion for OPEC producers in the first first 2 decades of the data set. But then starting in the 90s, there's no evidence of market power. So the results that I see, the result that I see that there's oligopolistic behavior among non-OPEC producers in the beginning of the period is consistent with work by Roncaglia in 1985, who characterized the world oil market until the early 1980s as a trilateral oligopoly. So he sort of anecdotally thought that the world oil market, he had evidence that the world oil market was oligopolistic, and my results are consistent with that. And then my result that there's collusion among OPEC producers in the earlier period is consistent with the results of Griffin in 1985, who finds that over the time period 1971 to 1983, the partial market sharing cartel model could not be rejected for all 11 countries. And then the result that the OPEC producers have not succeeded, including in recent years, is consistent with work by Marcel and Mitchell in 2006 and by Sperling and Gordon in 2007, who mentioned that the state-owned companies that comprise OPEC have juggled multiple objectives, economic and otherwise, and therefore have not acted so as to maximize joint profits. This result is also consistent with my earlier work where I simulate a basic hoteling model, and I find that a monopolistic market structure better explains the world oil market than perfect competition does prior to the 1973 Arab oil embargo, but that perfect competition fares better in explaining the world oil market after 1973. And I'd like to add to this Dr. Al-Haji's work, which shows that I'm eager to read, that shows that there hasn't been very much market power. So that the recent years that show that OPEC hasn't been including is consistent with that. And then I also, as promised, I have estimates of the shadow price of oil, which, as I mentioned before, is a measure of the scarcity of the resource. And you can see that the shadow price, so this is basically coming from the year effects specification. So this is allowing for a flexible shadow price that doesn't necessarily rise monotonically over time. And in fact, you see that when we allow for the shadow price to be flexibly specified, it does not rise monotonically over time. So this is evidence for stock effects in extraction costs. So there's evidence that as you're extracting more of the oil, you end up extracting more expensive grades of oil, so it becomes more expensive to extract the marginal unit of oil the more you extract. And I also find that in the most recent years, we have an uptick in the shadow price of oil. So this is potentially reflecting the scarcity of the resource. So in the past, technology has enabled us to offset the geologic scarcity of oil, but now, so that economically oil hasn't been scarce in the past, but now in the recent years, the scarcity has sort of outweighed the ability of technology to outweigh it. We see some rising trend in this shadow price in recent years. And so my conclusions are the following. So first, I've developed and estimated a dynamic model of the world oil market with minimal functional form assumptions. My results support oligopolistic behavior among non-OPEC producers and collusion among OPEC producers, except in the last 15 years. I find that the shadow price does not rise monotonically, which is evidence for stock effects in the extraction costs. And I find that the recent rise in the shadow price reflects the rising economic scarcity of oil. And there are several implications for policy I'd like to draw on this preliminary research. First, I think that this research, instead of explaining everything about OPEC, it actually just opens more doors and more questions that we need to answer. So we need to better understand what OPEC is doing, so it doesn't appear to be colluding the way economists think of collusion in the recent years. So we need to better understand what exactly it's doing, especially since OPEC countries are considering not only economic objectives, but also other objectives as well. And it's important to incorporate these objectives into our models. And this is also important, as was mentioned in some of our earlier talks today, that the dependence on imported oil and sort of security concerns highlight the need to better understand OPEC and OPEC behavior. And also a second policy conclusion I'd like to draw from the research, the preliminary research, is that we need incentives to promote research and development in renewable energy. So this is both because we depend on imported oil, which has security implications to that, and also because my results on estimating the shadow price of oil show that there's a rising scarcity of oil. So it behooves us to start considering alternative sources of energy, since at some point oil may not be able to supply all of our needs. Thank you.